I went back to Montana in 2017 to attend a reunion of my Roundup High School class of 1957, and then visit a few places where I grew up in Roundup, Billings, and Hardin. On the way back home, I stopped by some of the tourist attractions in Wyoming and the Black Hills of South Dakota. I graduated from Roundup High School in 1957 with a class of 46 students. High school had been a great adventure for us. Along with our studies, we played sports, attended the games, and cheered lustily for all of our Roundup Panthers teams. We acted in school plays, worked on school publications, and sang in the chorus or played in the band. Here are some of our most memorable teachers. Many of us work part-time during the school year and full-time during summer vacations. Ours was the last class to graduate from the old Roundup High School building constructed in 1918, but was then being held together by steel tie rods. The next class would attend school in a new building. My family had moved to Roundup during my sophomore year, when Mother and Father purchased the Parkview Motel. Roundup at that time was a bustling community of about 3,000, with a couple of large coal mines still operating, lots of oil field activity, summertime tourism, a railroad, and numerous farms and ranches throughout Muscle County. Although coal mining had declined with the dieselization of the railroads and natural gas replacing coal for home heating, oil field expansion had kept employment up. Following my junior year at Roundup High School, I attended Montana Boys State, where a presentation by a West Point cadet made a lasting impression on me. So I applied to our Congressman Leroy Anderson for an appointment, and I also obtained a recommendation from Dr. O'Neill, Roundup's primary doctor who was active in state politics. I received a first alternate appointment, then traveled to Denver to take the entrance exams. When the results came back, the principal appointee had failed, so I then received the appointment. Within a couple of months, I was on an airliner headed for New York. So now I'm back in Roundup for our 60th class reunion, which turns out to be a picnic in the Roundup City Park, just across the street from our old motel, which had burned down shortly after Mother and Father sold it. We are celebrating together with the class of 1958 and in conjunction with the annual Roundup Klein picnic. I haven't been back to Roundup for a class reunion in 28 years, since 1989, when about 25 of my classmates showed up. Correspondence with Punky Davis and a phone call from Wayne Saylor have prompted me to drive 1,600 miles to revisit this place and these people. It's a beautiful Sunday in the middle of August, 80 degrees and no humidity. I had arisen early and had breakfast at the Busy Bee Cafe, along with a coffee group of local ranchers. Then I met Wayne Saylor and John Lakey at the Autumn's Inn Motel for more coffee and pastries. With nothing else to do, we all headed over to the reunion a couple of hours early. Here I find that some of my classmates, including Susan Allen, and a few old friends have arrived early. What a joy it is to see them again. Linda Rum has set up the registration table and is soon joined by Erna Newton to check folks in. Shortly, more classmates arrive. Frank Goffner, who still runs the family ranch east of Roundup, and Jean Shields, who also lives on her family ranch. Terry Glennie and wife Janet Eliason, who live and work in Billings, and Jim Fletcher. 16 classmates will eventually show up. Then I learned that classmates Bob Rux, Chuck Norick, and Larry Napsel have died in the last couple of years. In all, 16 classmates have passed on. After tables and chairs and piles of food arrive, we all pitch in to a delicious lunch. It is a most enjoyable afternoon, thanks to the organizing efforts of Erna Newton, Punky Davis, Kathy Ross, and Jim Fletcher. Following lunch, we gather for class photos. After everything is cleaned up, and most folks have departed, some of us who will be staying overnight in Roundup hang around to tell stories and relive the old days. Wayne Saylor, Penny Lucas, and myself eventually have dinner together at Roundup's Grand Restaurant and Casino. It's the only place we can find open on a Sunday evening. I spend most of the next day driving around town, taking photographs and talking to people. As I drive down Main Street, I am saddened to see most of the old buildings vacant, empty storefronts, and for sale signs everywhere. The old theater has been converted to some kind of a private residence. Then I learned that the population has dropped from 3,000 folks 60 years ago to about 1,700 today.
He's got a U.S. flag on his front porch to remind everyone where he lives. And up in the attic there are papers that prove the old house is finally his. After 35 years the grass still don't grow in that rock-hard West Texas ground where my old dad still clings to that old coyote town.
Roundup is located along the Musselshell River, a river which was first discovered and named by Lewis and Clark as they traveled through central Montana in 1805. To the south of Roundup is a range of low hills known as the Bull Mountains. Legend has it that two old surveyors were mapping the region, and one looked off in the distance and said, "What shall we call that range of mountains over there?" The other old surveyor answered jokingly, "Ah, Bull, those ain't mountains, they're hills." The first surveyor snapped back, "That's it, we'll call them the Bull Mountains." These mountains were later discovered to contain rich deposits of high-grade bituminous coal. During the latter half of the 1800s, this region in central Montana was open range country with large herds of cattle grazing everywhere. Every year the ranchers would hold their cattle roundups on the high grassy tableland where the present city of Roundup now stands. By 1883 a small community had sprung up, and it quite logically became known as Roundup. Then in 1907 Roundup's first coal mine opened, and in 1908 the railroad came to Roundup. Homesteaders also had come out west to take advantage of free land and settle along the Musselshell River. Even a couple of high-born Englishmen, Lowther and Clifton, came directly from England to live on a remote ranch along the Musselshell River for over 30 years. These were the best of times. By 1912, the population of Musselshell County was over 9,000 souls. Today's population is 4,600. Homesteading along the Musselshell back in the early 1900s could be a lonely and forbidding way of life, but some families made a go of it. The Lou Goffner family first homesteaded at the head of Perriott Creek, about 15 miles east of Roundup, in 1911. Mr. Goffner worked diligently improving his property and eventually acquired adjoining properties to build a successful farming and ranching operation. His grandson, Frank Goffner, my classmate at Roundup High School, now operates the Goffner Ranch. Another old homesteader who made a go of it was J.W. Newton. In 1886, he and his brother took a place along the Musselshell, just a mile east of Roundup. It was paradise with grass, belly deep to a horse. But a hard, cold winter in 1886 killed off their livestock and put them out of business. J.W. left Roundup for a period of 10 years, but finally came back to operate his ranch and become a highly successful businessman, operating a meat market, hardware store, implement company, lumber yard, and artificial ice plant. He was the first mayor of Roundup. He donated the land for the present fairgrounds and named it Marion Park in honor of his wife. It was his great-granddaughter, Erna Newton, who helped to organize this year's high school reunion. The coal mining industry sustained Roundup's economy for almost 50 years, at one time employing about 1,500 miners. Roundup coal enjoyed a good reputation for clean burning with a high BTU content, and was particularly favored by the railroads. Roundup's first large mine, Mine Number 1, opened in 1907, but was soon closed due to flooding problems. Roundup Coal Mine Number 3 then opened in 1908 and continued in operation until 1962. It was Roundup's largest coal producer. At one time, it employed 600 men. Coal mining was hard, dirty work, but it did provide steady employment.
Come and listen, you fellers, so young and so fine, and seek not your fortunes in the dark, dreary mines.
The other large mine was Republic Coal Mine Number 2, located about 3½ miles south of town. It first opened in 1909. A community grew up around this mine that came to be known as Klein. The Milwaukee Railroad owned and developed this mine and community with company-owned housing, a company store, a saloon, boarding house, and amusement hall. This mine utilized a 387-foot vertical shaft to reach the coal seam, and operated steam-powered lifts until the mine was electrified in 1930. Mules that lived underground were used to pull the coal cars within the mine until 1930. They were driven by mule skinners who were just about as unpredictable as were the mules. After railroad locomotives were dieselized, demand for this coal vanished, and the mine finally closed in 1956. The Klein community has a rough and tumble, yet colorful history. The saloon never closed during the Prohibition era, and in addition there were many home brew joints in full operation. Klein was noted for its cave homes created by Croatian miners in the early 1900s.
And the sun never shines, well, it's dark as a dungeon way down in the mine.
At the start of the 21st century, there was a resurgence of coal mining activity when an eastern utility company, First Energy, began developing a new underground coal mine in the Bull Mountains about 20 miles south of Roundup. The mine would be highly automated, using longwall mining techniques, and the coal would be shipped to power plants around Lake Erie using railroad coal trains. Coal would also be shipped to countries in Asia. The state of Montana helped with the construction of a 35-mile railroad spur to connect the mine to the BNSF main line. It was estimated that the mine would produce 12.5 million tons annually. The Signal Peak mine began production in 2009, employing about 300 miners. Unfortunately, natural gas soon began to replace coal as the fuel of choice for power plants, and environmentalists viciously attacked the coal industry. In 2016, production at the Signal Peak mine had dropped to 5.5 million tons. One Roundup business that has hung on tenaciously is the local newspaper, the Roundup Record-Tribune. It was founded in 1908 by Alfred William Eislein, a young printer and newspaperman from Minnesota. He was an early promoter of Roundup and Muscle County, but struggled mightily to keep the paper alive during the Great Depression and World War II. His grandson, Eric Rasmussen, now runs the paper. I stopped by the Muscle County Courthouse. Not much has changed here in 60 years. Then I visit the county jail and grab a quick picture of Sheriff Michael Thomas. When I ask him if the sheriff still arrests high school kids at beer bus, he says no. The problem now is drugs. I worked one summer for C. Brewer Trucking at this old building where I washed and greased a fleet of Diamond T trucks used in oil field work. Clyde's youngest son, Dwayne, now runs the company at this location, and they do excavation work. Roundup now has a new elementary school, which replaces the old central school first constructed in 1911. I once had an after-school job of sweeping floors in this old building. The former St. Benedict's parochial school is now the Musselshell Valley Historical Museum and is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. The old high school building is still there, and it now serves as a community center. St. Patrick's Church still graces Main Street. On Monday afternoon, I tore around some more of Roundup's abandoned buildings and began to wonder where people shop and bank and get things fixed. On the internet, I guess. Then I drive 33 miles out east of Roundup to a couple of old, almost ghost towns, Musselshell and Millstone. As I'm driving along, an old Alan Jackson song comes up on the radio. That seems to tell the story.
I remember walking round the Court Square sidewalks, looking in windows at things I couldn't want. There's Johnson's Hardware and Morgan's Jewelry, and the old Lee King's apothecary. They were the little man, the little man. I go back now, the stores are empty, except an old Coke sign dated 1950. Boarded up like they never existed, or renovated and called historic districts. There goes the little man, there goes the little man. Now the Court Square's just a set of streets that people go around, but they seldom think about the little man that built this town before the big money shut him down and killed the little man. Oh, the little man. He pumped your gas and he'd clean your glass. One cold rainy night he fixed your flat. A new store came where you do it yourself, and you buy a lotto ticket and food off the shelf.
Billings, Montana was my childhood home from 4 years old until I was 15. In contrast to Roundup, this city has seen an explosion in its population. During the past 60 years, the Billings metro population has gone from 60,000 to over 166,000. Billings is the major commercial center and airport hub for southern Montana and northern Wyoming. The Lockwood suburb where we lived had the highest growth rate of any community in Montana from year 2000 to 2010. Billings was founded in 1882 by the Great Northern Railroad and was named for the railroad's president, Frederick Billings. It sits in the Yellowstone River Valley, with the downtown area surrounded on three sides by canyon walls dubbed rim rocks. You drive up Airport Road to get on the plateau atop the rim rocks. Here you find the airport, a great view of the city, and a monument entitled A Range Rider of the Yellowstone. It was donated to the city in 1927 by Mr. Bill Hart. It depicts he and his horse as symbols of the old cattle days in the valley of the Yellowstone. Billings is an oil refining center with 3 refineries capable of refining almost 200,000 barrels of oil daily. The city has benefited greatly from the Bakken oil field development on the Montana-North Dakota border and from other local coal and oil energy projects. Billings has transformed its downtown core into a beautiful and highly livable urban landscape with trees and flowers that provide a West Coast atmosphere. The Northern and General Custer hotels have been upgraded and still occupy key intersections downtown. Most impressive is the preservation of Montana Avenue as a historic district, a street I can remember as a rundown slum filled with drunks and hobos. There once was a movie theater at this corner where we could watch Saturday matinee westerns for 10 cents. Father sometimes bought lunch for us at a little hole-in-the-wall hamburger joint just off Montana Avenue, located where there is now a Mexican restaurant. They were small burgers like Crystal, but delicious. And of course the railroad still runs through Billings, dividing the city into the upper class north side and the lower class south side. Here are some places I remember from childhood as I drive along First Avenue South. One of my favorite places in Billings was North Park, where we sometimes had family picnics on a Sunday afternoon with Cousin Jackie and her mom. Finally, I drive back up Airport Road to the top of the Rims to visit the Yellowstone County Museum.
Once again, Montana's on my mind. Once again, Montana's on my mind. Once again, Montana's on my mind.
On my way out to visit our old home place in the Lockwood community, I stopped by to visit Pictograph Cave, located about 5 miles south of Billings, along a plateau above the Yellowstone River. As kids, we called this place the Indian Caves. Now it's a state park with a museum and full-time rangers on duty. And the location is quite beautiful, with sandstone cliffs rising sharply among tree-covered hills. The cave complex has long been a site of mystical power, a culturally significant gathering place for American Indians. On the interior wall of Pictograph Cave, archaeologists discovered 106 pictographs painted between 2150 and 200 years ago. The walls were covered with red, white, and occasionally yellow figurines, overdrawings originally painted with black. These pictographs are paintings of animals, warriors, and even rifles that document the story of the Native Americans of the area for thousands of years. They also found stone and bone tools, moccasins, arrow shafts, basketry, grinding stones, and jewelry made of seashells which had been acquired from West Coast Indians. Now I'm driving around in the Lockwood community, which is the suburban area of Billings east of the Yellowstone River. This area began life in 1907 as an irrigation district with water pumped from the Yellowstone River into 2 canals to irrigate flat bottomland along the river. This provided the means to grow valuable crops such as alfalfa and sugar beets. Then a community began to develop as people moved into Lockwood Flats, and 2 schools were built, the Lockwood Central School and the Pine Hill School. Mother and father purchased a 160-acre farm near Pine Hill School in the spring of 1945. Only about 1/3 of the land was irrigated farmland. In 1950, the school district hired a superintendent and constructed a new elementary school building on the site of the old central school. The old schools were closed. 3 years later, the district built a new junior high school. High school students then attended Billings Senior High School. Since year 2000, the growth of Lockwood community has been dramatic as people have moved into the Pine Hills surrounding the old Lockwood Flats. It's the fastest growing suburban area in Montana. With a population now exceeding 7,000, Lockwood is considering incorporation and construction of a high school. From the high school, I take a short drive down Hillner Lane. Then it's across Piccolo Lane to the Old Hardin Road. When we lived in Lockwood, the Old Hardin Road was a bone-jarring graveled road maintained by county road graders. Getting from our old place to downtown Billings required a trip of about 7 miles. The area was mostly farmland back then, with only a few houses. Now it's all green and civilized. When I get to the old Farnham place, I'm quite surprised to see that houses have been built back into the hills south of Old Hardin Road. As I drive into this subdivision area, I find hundreds of nice homes, all built within the past 20 years. And so I stopped to take some pictures. According to the Billings Gazette, a small black bear was recently spotted in this area.
Early morning rain, wild geese over the water, heading north and home again, bringing a warm wind from the south, bringing the first taste of the spring. His mother took him to her breast, softly she did sing. Oh, Montana, give this child a home. Give him the love of a good family and a woman of his own. Give him a fire in his heart. Give him a light in his eyes. Give him the wild wind for brother and the wild Montana skies.
As I approach our old home place, I realize that Interstate Highway I-90 now runs directly through the spot where our house once stood. When the state took portions of our farm back in the late 1960s through eminent domain to build the Interstate Highway, it left the remaining property chopped into small tracts with little value. Father was outraged by the government's monetary offer and refused their check for many years.
That summer, and he never learned to cry. He never knew his father, and he never did ask why, and he never knew the answers that would make it easy.
Prior to the construction of I-90, Mother and Father had subdivided and sold some of the property as small tracts. The real estate salesman working the project was a quick buck artist who sold the property to anyone and without many restrictions. This resulted in a low-class development. As we follow the road around, we come to the old Pine Hill School, which has been incorporated into an industrial cabinet shop. When I walked inside, the receptionist showed me the maple floor from the old school.
Brother in the wild Montana skies. On the eve of his 21st birthday, he set out on his own. He was 30 years in running when he found his way back home. Riding a storm across the mountains and an aching in his heart. Said he came to turn the pages and to make a brand new start. Now I never told the story of the time that he was gone. Some say
To end my tour of Lockwood, I drive up on top of the hills to look down on the community. The goat lady lived up here, and old man Gogger owned some property here.
Oh, Montana, give this child a home. Give him the love of a good family and a woman of his own. Give him a fire in his heart. Give him a light in his eyes. Give him the wild wind for a brother and the wild.
Now I'm headed south on I-90 on my way back to Tennessee, but I'll be stopping to visit various attractions along the route. My first stop is in Hardin, Montana, to revisit a place where I spent a winter as a 5-year-old boy. We had moved there temporarily in the fall of 1944 to be with my father, who was overwintering a flock of sheep. Hardin is close to the Crow Indian Reservation, and I remember Father talking with a Crow medicine man to find out what kind of a winter to expect that year. Supposedly, the medicine man could predict the winter weather by examining various aspects of nature, such as the thickness of the winter coat on animals. We lived in at least 3 different places that winter, with one place being particularly memorable. It was a roadside motel located in the cottonwood trees along the Bighorn River. I-90 now runs directly through the site, so it's hard to spot the exact location. As I walked along the highway looking for the old motel, this fellow offered me a ride. I declined the ride, but asked him to confirm that a motel was once located down by the river. He said yes. The thing I really remember about this place was watching the trains go past loaded with military equipment and sometimes with soldiers. Of course, this was during World War II, and the trains were headed for the West Coast, where ships were loading for the war with Japan. Before leaving Hardin, I stopped by the Bighorn County Historical Museum. Several historical structures have been relocated onto the grounds surrounding the museum. Inside are displays depicting life at Fort Custer during the late 1800s. The U.S. Army constructed this fort in 1877, following Custer's last stand the previous year. It was located on a high plateau along the Bighorn River a few miles south of Hardin. Various cavalry and infantry regiments were stationed here. Troops from this fort were first used to garrison Yellowstone National Park. The fort was finally closed in 1898. There are other displays depicting Crow Indian culture and early life in Bighorn County.
so soon. Please singing his tune, still singing his tune. And away gone day, and away gone night, and away gone dark, and away gone light. Up and away gone way, but you know where you gonna stay. Oh, brother of mine, we'll be singing someday. Yeah, we'll sing it someday. Yeah, we'll sing it someday. Yeah, we'll sing it someday. Under audio, yes, we'll be singing someday.
Now I'm at Crow Agency on the Crow Indian Reservation. Here you have the tribal headquarters for the Crow Indian Nation and the federal government Office of Indian Affairs that interacts with the tribe to manage the Crow Reservation. I've arrived at the start of the 99th annual encampment known as the Crow Fair. Crow people from all over the country will gather to camp out along the Little Bighorn River in traditional teepees and to celebrate their Crow culture with 4 days of drumming, dancing, horse racing, rodeo events, and parades. The event will attract 50,000 people and is one of the largest Indian powwows in the entire country. The Crow people originated from the eastern woodlands of Ohio, but were pushed westwards by stronger, better armed tribes. During the 18th and 19th centuries, they eventually became dominant in southeastern Montana and northern Wyoming, including the Black Hills. Then the Lakota Sioux and Cheyenne tribes, pressured by white incursion, began to force the Crow people farther west. The great Crow tribal chief named Plenty-Coup had a vision as a youth that the white men would soon occupy the entire country, and thus began his efforts to remain on good terms with the whites. When faced with the loss of their prime hunting grounds to the more numerous Lakota-Cheyenne alliance, Crow warriors joined with white soldiers to fight them. Custer's men had Crow scouts with them, and later cavalry regiments had entire troops of Crow warriors. Plenty-Coup remained a highly revered chief of the Crow tribe until his death in 1932, during which time he fought to preserve the Crow tribal lands and encouraged his people to become educated. His home in Pryor, Montana is now a state park. A short distance from Crow Agency was fought one of the most famous battles in American history, the Battle of the Little Bighorn, or Custer's Last Stand. The battlefield is now a national monument and a highly popular tourist attraction. I can remember coming to this site as a child when it was nothing more than an iron fence and a granite marker on top of a hill at the end of a dusty graveled road. It was here that Lieutenant Colonel Custer, along with 267 of his 7th Cavalry troopers, died after they had attacked a very large Indian camp along the Little Bighorn River on June 25, 1876. They were part of a three-pronged military campaign to force belligerent Indian tribes to move back onto reservations in the Dakotas and Nebraska. The discovery of gold in the Black Hills in 1874 brought a rush of white fortune seekers into a land which was sacred to the Native Americans. In the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, the U.S. government had guaranteed the Sioux Nation ownership of the Black Hills. When the government seemed powerless to stop this trespass on Indian lands, a confederation of Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes came together under the great Sioux chief Sitting Bull, determined to seek redress. As a cavalry general during the Civil War, George Armstrong Custer had built a reputation for leadership and gallantry. Now, on the morning of June 25th, Custer's Indian scouts warned him that they were approaching a very large Indian encampment, numbering in the thousands. Nearing the Indian village, he split his 600-man regiment into three 200-man battalions and ordered an immediate attack. One battalion under Major Reno attacked from the south, but was soon outflanked and overwhelmed by a large group of warriors numbering at least 500 under their chief Gall. After suffering many casualties, these troopers managed to retreat across the Little Bighorn River and up onto a ridgeline where they were soon joined by a second 200-man group commanded by Captain Benteen. This combined force managed to hold off the Indian attack until late the next day when a relief column finally arrived. Meanwhile, Custer's battalion moved back to the north and tried to cross the river to attack the village from a different direction. They also were met by an overwhelming force of warriors led by Crazy Horse, and retreated up to the hill where they made Custer's last stand. This battle was a tragedy for all parties. Custer lost his life, and the 7th Cavalry lost the battle. But the Indians lost everything. They lost their sacred land, the Black Hills, but even more importantly, they lost their freedom and their way of life. After the battle, the Sioux and Cheyenne tribes dispersed and were forced back on smaller reservations with more restrictions. The only survivor from Custer's last stand was a horse named Comanche. He was transported back to Fort Riley, Kansas, and lived for 16 more years. A new memorial honoring the Indians who fought and died in the battle has been added at Last Stand Hill. Now there are also a few red granite markers denoting where Indian warriors fell during the battle.
To help me with the chorus, and instead of spa we'll drink brown ale. We'll pay the reckoning on the nail, for that no man should go to jail from Gary or win in glory. We'll beat the bailiffs out of fun, we'll make the mayor and sheriffs run. We are the boys, no mender's done, if he regards a whole skin. And instead of spa we'll drink brown ale. We'll pay the reckoning on the nail, for that no man should go to jail from Gary or win in glory.
I spend the night in Sheridan, Wyoming, a delightful city of about 18,000, located in the Powder River Basin, with the Bighorn Mountain Range as a backdrop to the west. It was founded in 1882 and named after Civil War General Phil Sheridan. The historic railroad district includes the 1893 Sheridan Inn, said to be the finest hotel between Chicago and San Francisco. It has hosted such famous figures as Will Rogers, Buffalo Bill Cody, Ernest Hemingway, and President Calvin Coolidge. Across the street is the original railroad depot built in 1892. The lavish Trail Inn mansion, built by cattleman, former governor, and U.S. Senator John Kendrick between 1908 and 1913 attest to the fortunes and success achieved by local citizens. I have a delicious dinner at this place, and then walk around the downtown shopping district. Sheridan's core is well preserved and quite elegant for a small town of this size. It has an ongoing arts festival that displays bronze works throughout the downtown area. Fortunately for Sheridan, the Powder River Basin is great ranching country and is rich in coal and natural gas. Much of the coal burned by utilities in the entire country comes from large open-pit coal mines in the Powder River Basin and is transported by coal trains. About 20 miles south of Sheridan, I-90 crosses the Old Bozeman Trail near the location where the Army once maintained a fort to protect travelers along the trail. Fort Phil Kearny was built in 1866 to protect prospectors on the way to the Montana goldfields. It was under constant harassment by the Sioux and Cheyenne Indians until a new treaty was signed at Fort Laramie in 1868, which guaranteed certain lands, including the Black Hills, to the Native Americans. So the Army closed the post in 1868, after which the Indians burned it to the ground. Although Devil's Tower has long been a prominent landmark in northeastern Wyoming, the origin of the Mammoth Rock obelisk remains somewhat obscure. Geologists agree that Devil's Tower consists of molten rock forced upwards from deep within the earth. Debate continues, however, as to whether Devil's Tower is solidified lava from the neck of an ancient volcano, the walls of which eroded long ago, or whether it is a sheet of molten rock which was injected between rock layers. Geologic estimates have placed the age of Devil's Tower at over 50 million years, although it is likely that erosion uncovered the rock formation only 1 or 2 million years ago. Devil's Tower became a national monument in 1906. In recent years, climbing Devil's Tower has increased in popularity. The first known ascent of the tower occurred in 1893 by a couple of local ranchers. Today, hundreds of climbers scale the sheer rock walls of Devil's Tower each summer. Gently climbing from the town of Spearfish, South Dakota, on the northern edge of the Black Hills, Spearfish Canyon is one of the gateways into the heart of the ancient mountain range. Towering limestone cliffs and a rushing mountain stream keep you company along the 20-mile stretch of U.S. Highway 14A, known as Spearfish Canyon Scenic Byway. Spruce, pine, aspen, birch, and oak cling to the hillsides. Spearfish Creek flows along the canyon bottom, and the scenic byway follows the natural contours of the creek. At the end of Spearfish Canyon, we turned back to the north to visit the old gold mining city of Lead, South Dakota. Lead started life as a company town for the Homestake Gold Mine, the largest, deepest, and most productive gold mine in the Western Hemisphere. A total of 39.7 million ounces of gold and 9 million ounces of silver were produced from this historic mine. The mine opened in 1876 as an underground mine and remained in operation through 2001. Over 400 miles of underground workings extended for more than 8,000 feet below the surface. Rock temperatures could reach 130 degrees in the deeper parts of the mine. The Black Hills Gold Rush started in 1874 with placer mining panning for gold nuggets along the streams. Then in April 1876, a trio of men discovered the Homestake Motherlode, which they sold the following year to George Hurst and party for $70,000. Hurst brought in mining equipment and had an ore crushing and processing mill in operation by 1878. In 1879, Homestake Mining Company was listed on the New York Stock Exchange. Hurst consolidated and enlarged the Homestake property by fair means and foul. By 1900, Homestake owned 300 claims on 2,000 acres, being worked by more than 2,000 employees. In 1901, the company started using compressed air locomotives, replacing the mules and horses by 1920. And Cyanide Charlie Merrill began using cyanide for gold recovery to augment mercury amalgamation. The gold was shipped to the Denver Mint. In addition to the underground mine, an open cut, which was once a solid mountain, was operated until 1998. It eventually became 1,200 feet deep and a half mile across, with 48 million tons of rock removed. Today, the Homestake Mine houses an underground laboratory that performs scientific experiments which need the protection from cosmic rays offered by great depth in the earth. Next comes the famous gold rush town of Deadwood, South Dakota, with its well-preserved frontier-era architecture. The discovery of placer gold in 1874 gave rise to the new and lawless community of Deadwood, which quickly reached a population of 5,000. Since this was an illegal community on Indian land, territorial laws did not apply. Murder was common, with punishment not always fair and impartial. Prostitutes moved in and made a fortune. Early Deadwood became famous for its personalities, people who through stories and legend have become bigger than life. Wild Bill Hickok, Calamity Jane, Seth Bullock, Kitty Leroy, Miss Kitty, and Jack McCall. Wild Bill Hickok was shot from behind and killed while playing poker in this saloon by Jack McCall, an unsuccessful gambler. Hickok was a legendary figure on the western frontier as a gunfighter, lawman, gambler, wagon master, Union soldier, and spy. The hand of cards he held at the time of his death, 2 pairs, aces and eights, has become known as the Dead Man's Hand. Calamity Jane, whose real name was Martha Cannery, was a notorious frontierswoman, scout, and sometimes prostitute, who first came to Deadwood with the wagon train that brought Wild Bill Hickok. She was the subject of many wild stories, many of which she made up herself. She claimed to have a love affair with Hickok, and that she married to him and had his child. He always denied this, and there was never any proof. The town of Deadwood accepted her as one of its own and buried her next to Wild Bill. When the placer gold ran out, Deadwood settled down to become a civilized, law-abiding place. In 1961, the entire town was designated a National Historic Landmark for its well-preserved collection of 19th century frontier architecture. After gambling was legalized in Deadwood, many casinos and resorts moved in to bring prosperity back to the town. Now it's a major tourist attraction.
I've been working my knee store. I've been searching for the curtain you can't draw. I've been able to enable my way forward. I've been waiting for my Tell me, I wonder, how do you do? I've been dreaming about believing in something. I've been sizing the horizon with my hand. I've been sneaking up and peeking at your door. I've been missing your permission, but no more. You love summer. How do you do? Tell me, I wonder. Show me how to. You love summer. How do you do? Tell me, I wonder.
I'm up early the next morning to visit Sturgis, South Dakota. The 2017 motorcycle rally is underway, but the place is still asleep when I arrive at 9 a.m. As I drive around town, I'm amazed by the size of the bars and the advertisements for motorcycle attorneys. It seems that Sturgis is no longer the raucous spectacle that it once was, when motorcycle gangs fought in the streets with wrenches and set fire to foreign-made bikes. Today, you're more likely to find doctors, lawyers, and accountants than Hell's Angels, although you'll still see them too, selling patches alongside corn dog vendors and scantily clad women hawking motorcycle insurance at an event that celebrates everything fast, loud, and powerful. The rowdiness of the past has been replaced by polo-shirted police officers recruited from departments across the country, with pay, housing, and meals for a week. They will make arrests for drunkenness, fighting, and indecency, thus leading to the demand for motorcycle attorneys. But the Sturgis Rally remains wildly popular. 500,000 riders from all over the world share in the camaraderie that's virtually impossible to understand unless you're a rider. Over half of the attendees will drive RVs and camp, or fly and stay in local accommodations. There are 3 major attractions at this year's rally. First, of course, is the riding, cruising Main Street, whipping through the Black Hills, rumbling past Mount Rushmore and Crazy Horse. The pavement here is smooth and gravel-free, with sweeping turns and vistas that make riding a joy. Second is the concerts, with more than a dozen musical acts performing each day in Sturgis and the surrounding campgrounds, including the rambunctious Buffalo Chip Amphitheater that can hold about 50,000. This is one of the nation's largest music festivals. Ozzy Osbourne headlining the 2017 Buffalo Chip Concert Series, joined by Night Ranger, the Doobie Brothers, Blue, Oyster Cult, and Lynyrd Skynyrd. Last but not least is watching everyone else. Saloons with seating for thousands line the two major streets in Sturgis, with benches and stools facing out so patrons can eat, drink, and people watch all at the same time. Body-painted women with strategically placed Band-Aids sashay down the sidewalks, sharing space with men in jackets proclaiming frequent Sturgis attendance via annual patches. Diners crane heads to watch women in leather shorts walk past, or admire a particularly loud and flamboyant chopper.
Fast on a rough road, riding high through the mountains, climbing, twisting, turning further from my home. Young like a new moon rising, fierce through the rain and lightning, wandering out into this great unknown. And I don't want no one to cry, but tell them if I don't survive, I was born free. I was born free. I was born free. Born free. Free like a river raging strong is the wind I'm facing, chasing dreams and racing.
Somewhere lost in all of this frenzied activity were the motorcycle racing and stunts that led to the original rally back in 1938, and now expanded to include a hill climb, motocross, and ramp jumps. It's all great fun, said a middle-aged elementary school teacher from Phoenix. People think bikers are something they really aren't.
Can't keep no change.